says I'm live. It says it should be getting information from Zoom. Let's resume my share.
Yeah, we got viewers.
Okay, everyone. Hopefully we've gone live. Sorry, we're starting about 10 minutes late. Had some issues connecting up our YouTube live. So if you have joined us, my name is Sophie Sparks, and I'm joined by Chris Love, who streamed himself building this fantastic viz that you should see on the screen in front of you right now. I'll put it into full screen mode. For the latest Tableau IronViz, the latest Tableau IronViz feeder contest, the third and final feeder contest for 2019. This feeder contest, you had to use a data set provided by the Associated Press looking at refugee arrivals in the US from, Chris, was it from 2009 to 2018?
Yes, it was, yes.
Perfect, cool. So everyone, if you would like to check out Chris's viz, and I highly recommend you do this, I'm going to drop this into the comments on the YouTube live screen. So please check it out. So if you did manage to watch Chris, he built this live in about, Chris, I think it was 3.5 hours.
Yeah, somewhere
2
around
weekends
that.
ago.
Yes, it was split over a couple of days. I took a couple of hours the first time just to get my ideas sorted, took a break overnight, and then started again the next day.
That's I think that's I watched I watched on and off as you built the viz, and I was unbelievably impressed. You managed to build and put together an IronViz entry in such a short period of time. I know many people get intimidated about entering IronViz because they believe they need to set aside some insurmountable amount of time to build a visualization. So I think it was really impressive to see you build one that looks fantastic, has a great narrative structure, and has some underlying thoughts and analysis in such a reasonable amount of time. And also, you know, in between the rest of your sort of weekend life with your kids, I know you had to pause a few times because there was sounded like your kids were sort of getting a bit stressed out and somewhere else in the house. You had to run and check on them.
Exactly. But yeah, such is family life.
No, cool. So I thought in the next sort of little while, I could go through some of the things I found most interesting watching building your viz. Anybody who's tuned in, if you have any things you'd like to ask Chris, please drop them into the comments on YouTube live, because we'd love to answer those as well. And of course, if you do want to watch all of 3.5 or so hours of Chris building his viz, you can catch that on the Information Lab YouTube channel, again, where this is being streamed. So I know it doesn't necessarily sound like the most stimulating watching, but you really get into it, and it's amazing to see other people's thought process, especially if you build visualizations yourself, to see how other people approach sort of problems. So Chris, the first thing I'd like to ask you is, where did the design inspiration come from this viz? Actually, it might be helpful if I go ahead and just step over run through what it looks like. So this is looking at refugee arrivals in the US. So I'll just have a quick step through. And this is Chris's visualization is, I'll just reconnect, trying to challenge and test people's assumptions around the numbers of refugees that arrived in the US over this period of time, and what do you think is happening with these arrivals? Are they increasing? Are they decreasing over time? Where are people going to? And if that is a sort of a fair share for the number of each state is taking a fair share of its number of refugees given the population size of each state. So you can sort of make a few assumptions, see what you think, and then test if your idea is actually comparable to reality. And Chris is using the reasonably new button feature. Chris, do you know when the nice button feature came out in Tableau?
I think it was 2019.1, so the first release this year.
Quite new, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, yeah. And it's a nice way. I started off, if you watch me in the feed, I started off using story points and then realized that story points don't offer that ability to keep an earlier selection where you select the state right at the start. It wasn't keeping that because story points are meant to have a fixed transition for parameters and things. So so these are a nice way just to jump across a number of dashboards.
Oh, that's really cool. I haven't used story points. I haven't made a story point viz since the button feature came out. So that's something I never would have thought of. And the buttons are much easier than before the button feature came out. You'd have to build a whole separate sheet, wouldn't you, with an icon,
yes.
and then sort of use that as a floating sheet. So these are much more user friendly. So I'm just sort of stepping through, Chris, your visualization, entering in some numbers, and having a guess and testing some ideas that I might have about in the state of California, refugee arrivals. How do they compare to, in this one, how many were settled in 2018 compared to other states? And my guess of 1,500 was a little bit over, but
it's not too bad.
Not too bad. And I'll step through to the where do I think most of them came from in 2018? Well, I know US has had some pretty stringent. This was 2009. I know a lot has changed policy-wise since then. And I know people, if you're seeking refuge in another country, either country of origin, probably in some sort of strife, either political or environmental. So in the last year, what have we got? We've had Ukraine. In the last few years, there's been issues there. Bhutan, Russia, Eritrea, Cuba. I'm going to go, I'll just go Bhutan and see what that looks like. Completely off. So California, Ukraine. Okay, so my idea that it was a country that was undergoing some turmoil was correct, but which country that was completely off. 3 people from Bhutan. I was nowhere near a good guess. And then that really highlights the big difference from 2009. Iraq and Iran are nowhere to be seen on this list of top refugee countries in 2018. Oh, they are, sorry, they're right down. Very different positions to what they were back in 2009. And we'll go through to the last page, and that's, so we've got 4 different, looking at 4 different points here. So Chris, this design for this visualization, if you watch the videos, you sort of lock in on the idea that you want to have a quiz very quickly. So by about minute, I've got down on my notes, 19 minutes and 30 seconds into your 3.5-hour visualizing process, you came to the idea that a quiz might be interesting. I will actually just jump out and play that video. How did you, so I'll just play it from this, I'll commentate over the top because I don't think it will pick up the audio very well. So this is when you're looking at different countries, you've built multiple views maps, and you are looking at what's happening across all these different years. And you lock in very quickly that people might have mightn't realize the sort of difference between 2009 and 2018, which you can see very obviously down here. Sheet 5, 2009, the first small multiples map is full of dots showing lots of people coming in from that country, while 2018 is completely empty. And you come to the idea that maybe testing people's assumptions in a quiz would be a good idea. So timestamp, we've got 2035. So is that usual for you to lock in on an idea so early in the viz making process?
I think so. I think there's obviously a couple of things going on here, because this is a viz I was recording, and I don't want to spend a long time taking lots of time to try and really dig into go down different blind alleys, and plus I was limited on time anyway with the Iron Viz weekend. So there is a little element of Schrodinger's viz. Would it have been the same if people weren't watching? But I do tend to get ideas pretty quickly. Sometimes those ideas end up in blind alleys, and I'll spend a couple of hours and then they literally won't go anywhere. But very often it's it's either something that I'll pick up throughout the kind of this exploratory process that you saw for the first 20 minutes. I'll pick up on a story fairly quickly, and that will be the one I want to try and get out through the visualization. So yeah, Tableau is great because you can do that exploratoriness. You can explore data very, very quickly. So it's certainly something that I tend to go through that process very quickly.
That's interesting. I'm sure not everybody has the same sort of locking in so fast and being so focused usually with their building process. Do you think that comes from having a background working in as a consultant, where maybe clients need answers more quickly, or is it sort of, are you usually very decisive in what you do?
It's perhaps an element of kind of what I do for a living, having to help people and kind of get to the nub of a solution very quickly. So I think that certainly plays into it. But I think it's just also, yes, I do tend to just decide and let's get on with it. With this one, I could see that story really popping out, and I wanted to highlight it. And the idea of a quiz really came from the fact that often I'll see iNvisors and they look great, but I don't learn that much from the process. There's not necessarily something I will take away and say, I learned that. It's often a very visual affair. So I wanted to create something very different to that. So I wanted to, and that's perhaps something I even decided before time, that because this was going to be a very quick visualization, I only had 2 days to do it. I knew it wasn't going to be a visual masterpiece that could kind of challenge those things. So I wanted people to learn from it. The actual inspiration for the quiz idea probably came from, I don't know whether you remember a while ago, I think it was the New York Times had some really cool interactive features where you could drag the mouse and say on a line chart where you wanted where you thought the trend disappeared to, and then it would show you your guess versus the actual data. So I think it takes in part some inspiration from that.
I do remember those at least one of those visualizations. I remember the line I drew was completely off what was actually happening in reality. And I think the over here in the UK, the ONS did some good ones as well about your neighborhood, how much you, but that was less drawing a line. That was more guessing a number. But again, it really challenged my sort of assumptions when you saw how, in my case, how different what I thought was happening compared to the actual reality of the figures. So it was a really good, good way to help people engage with the information by challenging what they think might be happening. You actually locked onto this sort of idea of a quiz, but then when I stepped through, you've got these 4 different pages. He's asking these 4 different questions. You actually locked on to, here we go. I'll just play this a little bit as well. You locked onto these ideas of asking these questions very quickly, and you actually wrote them out in a notepad. Is this a common thing for you to do? Write the questions out physically to guide you through, or is it was this again just something to help you stick to a tight time schedule?
This was probably as much for the audience and for my memory. I felt that if I'd agreed what I was going to do, I should at least kind of write it down and stick to it. So again, given that I was being watched, it's probably kind of guilty of helping the audience there. But yeah, taking notes isn't something I'm very good at, to be honest. I'm not a big designer up front. I don't sit and sketch out my visualizations. If I did, I think the end result would be miles different to what I sketched out anyway. So Tableau is my sketch pad. I'll play around with things. You perhaps saw in the video where I was trying to make things small, see if they'd fit onto a tall dashboard. They wouldn't. So in the end, at day 2, I decided on these big pages. And yeah, so that's my process. And then the notepad is really just a very quick way of just saying, well, let's kind of jot down the questions I had and remember them.
I often put, if I want to be very strict with what I'm building, like if you do a makeover Monday and you actually try and do it in an hour, I usually end up writing in the title of the viz like the question I'm trying to answer.
Yes.
And then I change that sort of last minute. But the same thing, if I can see it somewhere in front of me, it sort of keeps me honest.
Yes, exactly.
To what my idea was. Although sometimes that means at least for me, by the time I finish building something, that initial idea I latched upon, I realized I was maybe not the best one, and actually writing it down might have blinkered me from looking somewhere else. But at least it usually keeps me building within a
short time frame.
Time frame, because otherwise you go down these crazy rabbit holes. And right now we've got on screen, which is sort of 45 minutes into your build on Saturday, you've already got 7-8 sheets and a dashboard. So yeah, if you don't be a bit strict with yourself, you can, I'm assuming, ending up with many sheets. I also love your sheet naming here. It's good to see that even Zenmaster stick with sheet 2, 3, 4, 5, sheet 6 number 2, sheet 7.
Yeah, and that stays all the way through to the final viz as well. I just hide them and rename the dashboards if I need to.
That's I'm sure many of us feel like relieved we're not the only ones who do that. Actually, about your sheet and dashboard building process, if you looking at your viz, you sort of will change. You're not building. You're changing. You start building a view on one sheet, and you'll often change those views. I'll just play a little bit here to show what I'm talking about. So this is very early on in your vizzing process. I think we're only on the second sheet you've built, but you're just analyzing the data, and you're sort of looking at it in bar charts, and you change those orientations of the bar charts, and you actually end up with a table of numbers. Do you have any sort of set rules in your mind when you modify an existing sheet opposed to going onto a new sheet with your questions and your analysis?
No, what I'll probably do is just play on a single sheet, and I'm not very good at moving on. And only when I've got something that I think might be a keeper will I move on. If I either need to remember what it is I've done and kind of the analysis I found, or the particular question I was asking, then that will be the point that I either duplicate it, then move on, or if not, then I'll just carry on and do the same sheet. And sometimes I'm guilty of doing that, and then having to kind of plot my way backwards through the undo button to think, actually, what I had a long time ago was a lot better. I've talked to the devs at Tableau about having some kind of Photoshop or Lightroom-like drop down where you can select the point at which you made that, like almost snapshot it, and just give you an option to go back to, rather than having to duplicate sheets and see all the steps you made up to a certain point. Because I think that would be brilliant. That would save me a lot of time going back, because that is something that I do a lot of.
I actually really like that feature in Tableau Prep they have, where you can see each individual step you've done.
Yes.
And that's cleaning up a string, but you can step back through them. It is really, really helpful. I'm guessing in Tableau, since it's the underlying code must be so much more, so much more complex, that mightn't necessarily be possible.
No, yes.
Prep was built from scratch quite recently, so there's probably a lot more, probably much harder to fit some of those features into Tableau as it is now. But yeah, it would be fantastic to see. So once you've done this initial you got through this initial analysis, I'm going to jump through a few more of these tabs. You began to do you sort of built through a bunch of different sheets, and you'd locked in on some of these key ideas that you'd written down in that notepad at the start, with sort of asking those 4 questions. And then you spent a lot of time doing some basic, not formatting, but writing some, for each of the sheets, these calculated fields that will return. And this sheet is looking at, does each state have its fair share of refugees? So you brought in data looking at each state's population, then to see as a sort of a percent of the total population, is this idea of states accepting a fair share of the total number of refugees coming into the US in that particular year. And so this calculated field would say, if the answer, if people are accepting their fair share, then it would say less or more than their fair share. and then the amount it would actually take to equal a fair share or amount of refugees over the fair share that they've taken. How building these, I know people find sort of building these calculated fields where you're building them to return a text string that will be, a nice human readable text string. How complicated do you find them? So I'll play this little video. So this is where you've built this one out and now you're troubleshooting it. So two-part question. How often and how much time do you spend building out calculations to basically add some human context to your data? And then how do you go about troubleshooting them if they don't work at the first time?
Yeah, and I remember this one because it was a particular painful one to troubleshoot. I spent about 5-10 minutes. It seemed like an eternity, knowing that you're being live streamed. But I think the building out these text strings is something you do quite commonly, be it to put in a separate worksheet to build fake titles or text boxes that are dynamic. That's quite a common one because you need to build formulas because title sheets don't give you as much flexibility as that as the normal formula. So I'll often build those out. They can be quite complicated, particularly where you run into kind of aggregate and non-aggregate variable errors. So I spent a lot of time talking about these particular use cases in my talk at TC in Berlin, and so it can get quite complicated. On the video, you can watch as I try and troubleshoot this, and I end up kind of taking out bits of the if statement, deleting elements, putting in fake words so that I can check, is it working or not? Is it not? And really working through every possible combination, and that's, you've kind of got to do that. You've got to break down the logic and step by step. It's is this little piece of logic working? If it is, then let's move on to the next bit and just building up that building block until you get to a working solution or find which particular block is causing the problem.
I'll just drop that so that's the TC Europe talk you gave, when Tableau breaks.
Yes, that's right.
Cool. I'll drop that into the YouTube live. No, it's
yeah.
Sorry about that. I managed to unmute myself, but I was going in and dropping it onto the live stream. That was very cunning. So how did you manage to? I suggest people go watch the video, the recording of your TC Europe talk. What are some of the common ways you do troubleshoot them? Because that's sort of a whole process as well. I found really interesting looking at how you, and this is what's playing right now, going through from things like texting out, so putting a lot of your calculations and putting the 2 forward slashes in front of them to make them look like comments, to editing them on the fly within the pill. So I think in this one you actually go ahead and reopen up that calculation, and maybe it was a different one, but added sort of and removed brackets from the marks card when it was in a level of detail.
Yeah, and that often I'll also drag pieces out of the calculation as well and just kind of move those into the pane just to test individual parts of a calculation. As I say, it's all about those building blocks and working out, is each building block on its own doing what I think it is, and then breaking down the logic to say where's this going wrong. And there's no real shortcut. You've just got to step by step go through that.
Yeah, it's I use commenting out quite a lot as well, or put in ridiculous answers if I know a calculation should never give a negative number. If I make it whatever reply it gives put into a text string and I make it a negative number, then at least I know if the numbers it's returning look correct or not. If you put something that's completely far out and you're sort of purposely trying to break the calculation to make sure it's working as expected, and if you're expecting it to break, then make it obvious it's breaking in the way you expect it to. So yeah, we just saw in the replay there, you sort of got it to work and it returned the word correct. So you sort of knew that first part of the calculation was working.
Yeah, exactly. It's just using those fake bits and yeah, making it as simple as possible so you can check each piece.
And so how much time do you think you'd spend building a viz? So if we sort of look at this whole process was 3.5 hours, and you spent probably around the first 40 or so minutes coming up with the idea, looking through the data, connecting to additional data, in this case, sort of the populations by state, going through checking some of the terminology used. So especially, refugees arriving opposed to some, technical, those sort of terminologies actually have meanings of arriving opposed to entering the country and things like that. How much time do you spend sort of doing that initial analysis compared to building the bulk of the visualization up, compared to doing these things, which we just saw on screen now, which is these calculated fields that are really driving more of the narrative structure or the formatting of a visualization, and then the final formatting itself? What's usually the breakdown, assuming your data is reasonably clean at the start?
Yeah, I'd say probably quarter of the time is probably the only bit where you spend time, the actual charts themselves. Probably another quarter is getting the story right, and then the rest of it tends to be the window dressing, the stuff that the user experience, the titles, the design, everything else that goes to making it a good experience for the user. That's the bulk of the work, I think. It just, in terms of just getting some charts, that tends to be very, very quick for me.
So it's about once your data is clean, so that can obviously take up a lot of time. It's about half the time of building a viz is the window dressing.
Yeah, definitely the user experience. Yeah, in my experience, because you want the user to have a good experience. That's kind of weird, and it depends what audience and kind of the function of the viz as well. It's not, I wouldn't say every viz I make breaks down precisely along those lines, particularly if you're doing business dashboards. It might be a little bit simpler than that. You have to spend, there's often simpler mechanics involved there. This one had some quite complex mechanics and that I wanted the user to build out.
No, it's from business I've built, I'd say that's very fair, half the time, or possibly even more, especially if you have an idea, or if it's for a client, if the client has a very particular design function they need. And usually something that sounds the easiest is not is not necessarily easy at all. For instance, changing the Tableau's default word, saying all, if you've got multiple potential values returned, returns the word all, and sometimes if you want to change that word to something else, in the titles, for instance, it doesn't always work the way you expect it, or the page's function, you might drag that on and you want it just to show the current year, but it'll show the range of all current years within the data set. So some of those should be very easy, and you end up having to spend quite a bit of time creating rather horrendous calculated fields to work around these aesthetic points.
Yeah,
but they're usually the ones that really change something from, oh, this is an interesting, good visualization, to something that's really impactful and engages with the audience.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. I think that's probably about all the main points I sort of had from when I watched you build, what I thought was particularly, so I'm just going through a few of these particularly interesting, and I wanted to ask you questions about. So if anybody is watching and you do have any questions, please drop them into the chat, so we can answer those. But Chris, is there anything you found by building this viz so quickly, or building it with an audience watching, that you found was different from your normal vizzing process, or you found was exciting?
I think certainly the process of having people watching focuses you on getting things out quickly and that focuses the mind quite a lot on what you're doing. I was also, I think right at the start, I said I wasn't going to do much commentary, and then I found my process makes almost no sense without commentary. You can't just watch someone visualize and expect to understand what they're doing. You have to see what's going on in their head and why they're doing the different steps. So I thought that was quite an interesting process, having to commentate on what you were doing and explain why. And it made me think a lot more about why do I do certain things. So it was quite enlightening from my perspective to hear what I was doing and trying to explain why.
That's it's almost like if that is a useful process, it's almost so Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, the first book, when he's talking about, I can't remember, but somebody has a secretary who just goes around and collects all his he leaves voice messages on other people's answering phones. If he has an idea, he just calls somebody up and like leaves them a voice message, and that's his way of thinking out loud and getting an idea out. So I guess having to commentate on your own visualization with potentially people watching is sort of a similar experience.
Yeah,
help focus your mind.
Exactly. Yeah, it does. It helps. It helps put into words your ideas. Yeah.
Oh, very cool. Perfect. Well, is there anything else you'd like to talk about, Chris, or should we let everybody get back to their afternoons?
No, I'm happy to wrap up there. If there's no other questions, that's fine.
Perfect. I'll just check and see if there's anybody else who's dropped anything on the chat. I don't think they have. So for everyone who's tuned in, thank you so much for joining Chris and I this afternoon, and also thank you for putting up with us starting the stream a little bit late. Apologies for those technical difficulties. I hope you've had a great time listening to Chris answer some questions about his visualization process. If you would like to ask him anything else about how he builds business, you can catch him on Twitter. His handle is @ChrisLuv, ChrisLuv. And please do check out his IronViz visualization, and also everybody else who submitted visualizations to IronViz. I think that's something 86 of them or something this time. There was
a lot, yeah.
Really, really interesting visualizations, and it was very interesting to see all the different angles people took, because everyone had to use at least one underlying data set. So there are lots of different things people pulled out of that and focused on. So it's very interesting to see the range of stories that can come out of one particular data set. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, everybody who's joined in. We're running another of these Watch Me Viz next Monday. So next Monday at 4 p.m., I believe it is British Summer Time. We have Andy Kriebel doing his Makeover Monday live and commentating on his Viz building. So he, I think, is looking to build a Viz in about an hour. So it'll be a very rapid build. So please tune in for that. We'll be tweeting about it with the link you can join for that. So please let us know if you're finding these Watching Viz live interesting. And thank you so much, Chris, for kicking this off for us.
No, thank you, Sophie.
Cool. Have a good afternoon.
Cheers, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.